or whether this may be other kinds of criminalized identities, right? And especially this condenses really tightly around the question of bathrooms and so on and so forth. And that's where the obfuscation of reproductive rights with sexuality, with sex education really kind of happens. And if you were to think about who has to ensure these rights, and because rights have to be claimed from certain kinds of body, it's really difficult to think of right to sexuality education right now, challenging sexual cultures, if it is to come from the state, especially as the state is increasingly invested in criminalizing sex itself. And that's the other side of the rights-based discourse. In fact, even something like sexual harassment has been brought into criminal law. And this is the same state that will then use sexual shame, which you kind of let go of in a safe space of the classroom, will use sexual shame both to produce ideological effects, but also in state violence like torture, custodial violence, and so on and so forth, right? If it is the university that is supposed to provide these rights, then we know that departments that actually address gender and sexuality are currently under target, whether it's by underfunding or actually systematically being dismantled. And the only places where sexuality education is actually thriving is the private university. What that tells us about sexuality education, I will leave for a larger question. And if these rights are supposed to be provided by teachers, then where do questions of the precarious employment of teachers in state university actually happens? In fact, the only two kinds of right-based bodies that emerge in the last few years are our students themselves and the administration, right? And the university administration. So actually teachers are sans rights themselves. So a right to sexuality education is a right to learn sexuality education, but not actually practice it or give it, because it does not actually empower the teaching body at all. And of course, who will these teachers be? As we saw with the controversy around the NCERT curriculum, it can't really be trans people or sex workers and so on and so forth. It really has to be normative, respectable people. In fact, trans people, sex workers will most likely be kept out of these classrooms in order to provide safe spaces and, again, the haunting of the predator. So really, in last remarks, and I'll end with this, however, I am also not really on the side of queer studies, which has this kind of paranoid relation to institutionality. Even though all of these theories actually of sexuality, whether Freud or Foucault or whatever, rely on institutional apparatuses to make them possible. So whether it is the clinic, the university, the archive, cinema, whatever you may have, sexuality actually proliferates only institutionally. So the question really is to kind of open that institutional relation really clearly. One is, of course, to kind of open up sexuality itself to its deep relation to policing. And instead of seeing policing itself as some kind of repressive apparatus that works on liberatory sexuality, we might actually think of policing itself as one of the greatest kind of pleasurable sides of sexuality. There's great fun and pleasure and fantasy in policing other people. And this actually, Ketki Chadani's work on sexuality education also reveals really quickly that peers actually produce conversations about sexuality precisely by deeply repressive apparatuses. And the other is, of course, that a lot of people don't actually rely on sexuality. Those who think that we don't actually need these institutions are actually people who don't actually have to spend time explaining or elaborating who they are in front of bureaucracies and institutions, right? So if there are actually trans people in our classrooms and queer people in our classrooms who will need to access anything from bank accounts to basic social security, then we do need some form of sexual education. My only thing will be that instead of actually thinking about sexuality education in that kind of pedagogical sense, where we produce good moral and political and ethical subjects who relate to each other ethically, we might actually have to thin out that version towards a kind of only towards sexual literacy. So think about it as like, for example, the ability to say sign a bank form when we think about literacy itself, right? And so instead of actually thinking about a thicker notion of sexuality education, we might actually think of a thinner understanding of sexual literacy, And might that be a more kind of interesting way of putting all of these things in the current moment together? So I'll stop there. And sorry for exceeding my time. And over to Saptarshi.
All right. Thank you, Charul, for inviting me here, and thank you for the opportunity to share panel space with Vikram. I'm going to. So I started thinking about this question as a lawyer and a legal scholar. One way to think about, one way to engage with the question whether sex education is a right or not, is to look for an authoritative pronouncement that says that it's a right, that declares that this is a right, right? And many people indeed do that. So there are works that look at the pronouncements of international human rights treaty bodies, the international human rights treaties that India is a party to, and the kind of binding international obligation that the Indian state has to provide sex education at every level of education. I'm not particularly fond of that approach, because then the inquiry just stops there. The moment you find an authoritative pronouncement, the inquiry stops there. You do not have to sort of proceed further. You just conclude with the answer that yes, there is a right to sex education. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and think about it differently. I'm going to engage with the question slightly differently. I'm going to start with a definition of sex education, and then bring a concrete situation to see if it's possible to see traces of that definition of sex education, or a right to sex education in a concrete situation. So I'm going to start with this definition of sex education adopted by the UN Population Fund, the UNFPA, and UNFPA thinks about sex education as a rights-based, gender-focused approach to sexuality education, whether in school or out of school. Right. So this does not limit us to the space of the school, or it does not limit us to the adolescent category. It's irrespective of where sex education is provided. And then it involves discussing gender, body anatomy, sexual and reproductive health, sexual rights. It involves developing a positive attitude towards pleasure, intimacy, discussions on violence, relationships, and so on and so forth. Right? So now let's talk about. I want to talk about a particular case that happened last year. This is a woman who lives in Kerala. Her name is Fatima. She's a feminist artist. She's an activist. And there is this incident where she shoots a video with her children. And in the video, you can see that she's lying on a bed, and she's having her children, her 14-year-old son and her 8-year-old daughter, paint on her naked body. And you can see the upper half of her body in the screen, and the children are painting. And after shooting this video, she posts it on Facebook along with a statement. Now, and the moment she posts it on Facebook, it circulates, and then complaints are filed, and the police, Cochin police, they file several cases against her, against Fatima. They book her under child pornography. They book her under offenses under the Information Technologies Act, under the Juvenile Justice Act, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to read out portions of the statement. So this is a long statement. I'm just going to read out a couple of lines. They have to grow up seeing the natural women's bodies. These seeds need to be sown when they are young with proper sex education as well as sexual consciousness. No child who has grown up seeing his mother's nakedness and body can abuse another female body. Therefore, vaccines against these false perceptions and expectations about women's bodies and sexuality should be initiated from the home itself. Within the current family situation of our society, there is only little room for openness associated with sexuality or nudity. While in school, the untouchability divides people into girls and boys. That is where the fear of female body begins for girls, as well as curiosity of the female body begins for boys. And in the rest of the statement, Fatima is basically trying to dismantle these structures. She's trying to sort of go beyond these ideas and then sort of do sex education her way as a mother, as a feminist activist. And that's the crux of the statement that she uploads along with the video. The original one is in Malayalam, but this is the English translation that appears in the judgment. Now, once these cases are filed, she approaches the High Court for anticipatory bail. So anticipatory bail is you haven't been arrested, but you fear that you might be arrested. And so you ask for a bail in advance, even before you have been arrested. And the High Court has the jurisdiction to grant anticipatory bail based on the based on the facts and circumstances of the case. So this is a discretion that the High Court uses. Now, at the bail stage, you don't decide, a judge does not decide whether an offense has been committed or not, right? In this case, interestingly, the Kerala High Court almost pronounces its verdict on Fatima's guilt at the bail stage itself. And the judgment is funny because throughout the judgment, the judge says that this is not the stage at which we have to decide whether she has committed a crime or not, whether she has committed the crime that she's been charged with or not. And at the same time, he's sort of sharing his opinion on the charges. So, for example, one of the charges was that she was of child pornography, which is an offense under the POCSO Act, the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. Now, the wording of the offense is that an act is an offense if it entails using a child for sexual gratification. So if Fatima has to be held guilty of child pornography, it has to be established that she used her children for sexual gratification. Yeah. The judge says that, well, yes, of course, this is sexual gratification. And then he instructs the investigating agencies to look at Fatima's expressions in the video. So the idea is that, of course, this is sexual gratification. She's doing it for her sexual gratification. And it also entails using children because they're just there. Similarly, the offense under the Information Technology Act is of sort of facilitating abusing children online. Again, the judge says that, well, this has to be decided later. But at the same time, in the same document, he says, of course, it's facilitating the abuse of children online for the simple reason that they're there, for the simple reason that they're part of that frame where they're being depicted in an obscene and in an indecent manner. And at the end of so the judge basically rejects the application for anticipatory bail, saying that she, of course, is free to educate her children the way she wants because she's the mother, but I do not agree with it. So at the same time, in the same document, the judge says that, of course, she's the mother, and it's her prerogative, it's her privilege to educate her children the way she wants to, and she's. But at the same time, I'm not going to grant her anticipatory bail. I'm not going to protect her from imprisonment because I don't agree with how she is discharging that responsibility or discharging that privilege. So what this and the case is still sort of continuing. Fatima approached the Supreme Court against the Kerala High Court's sort of rejection of anticipatory bail, and the Supreme Court also said the same thing. It also did not protect her from arbitrary arrest. And currently the case is on. But what it kind of tells us uh, in a very concrete manner that there is this sort of fundamental incompatibility between sexuality and education in as far as the legal system is concerned. So there is an admission that sex education is necessary, and it's the mother's prerogative to provide it, and the children's right to receive it. And at the same time, there is this reluctance to think about sexuality as a matter of education. It's almost like there is an understanding of education, but what kind of education does not, and what kind of education will it be if it does not involve risks, if it does not involve experimentation, as Fatima was doing, if it does not involve sort of pushing the boundaries. So although sex education may be present as a human right in all these UN declarations and pronouncements that India is party to, we have reasons to be doubtful about about this formulation as a formulation of sexuality education as a right. And I could talk about these ideas of obscenity and indecency and how they interact with education at a later point of time. But I just want to sort of pause here. Yeah.
Those were some wonderful, wonderful set of comments. Thank you so much, both of you. Just thinking in relation to what you were saying, Vikram, and also it somehow correlates with what Saptarshi was pointing us towards. And I constantly think a lot about this idea of a safe space and classroom, which is imagined always as the safe space. And you talked about the pleasure point of sort of policing. That policing what is forbidden is also there is some element of pleasure in it. So then the classroom, which is a place which is always a policed space. Can it ever be imagined then as a safe space? Because it's that quite just thinking about these terms here. So any first comments?
You. No, okay, this is a tough one. It's not an easy one to answer, simply because also I am no longer teaching in a kind of classroom setting, so I am relying on kind of secondhand experience, and also all my experiences are of teaching are almost ended when the Me Too movement began, and so there's a kind of another conversation around safe spaces that kind of happened in its aftermath, which I haven't been able to participate in a classroom way. I have participated in other ways. So I think the query is quite legitimate about thinking about the classroom as a safe space, and one hopes that it is. But I am also skeptical of hope being attached to institutions. And so I'm skeptical of liberation, whether in the classroom, which we know to be actually deeply violent spaces fundamentally. And there's a kind of erasure in our policies, in university guidelines, and so on and so forth, of the deeply violent nature of everyday life in universities, that institutions proliferate, encourage, erase, quieten. And this can be told from not just kind of sexually minoritized communities, but caste oppressed communities, disabled people, and so on and so forth. And so really, the question really is, safe spaces are like what makes a safe space, and so my worry, unfortunately, has been, say, for example, around sexuality, of the changes towards, say, sexual harassment, where it's
Yeah.
been increasingly criminalized. And so you have the intervention of a completely different apparatus of the police and the security state come in, the carceral system, and so on and so forth comes in really deeply. Um, and the university gets to kind of throw up its hands. And so that's the hand is also how the university kind of protects its own people. It's kind of higher up authorities, quietens and kind of makes life miserable for students who suffer any kind of violence and are articulate about it. So really the infrastructure of the university, the formal infrastructure of the university is not what makes a safe space anymore, right? And the
Yeah.
safe space is really in student cultures that emerge, or whatever might be kind of paralegal structures that emerge within the university, whether it's like a teachers union, whether it's a student body, whether it is various kinds of group and collective formations that happen in response to an event, and so on and so forth. Those informal or semi-formal networks are the only things that are stepping outside the carceral system to kind of protect the student. But these are also, remember, mostly post-event, that they happen because something has happened, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the safe space conversation is really kind of right now not the most optimum conversation to have, and I think we have to reconcile that with the current classrooms that we are seeing, whether in schools or in colleges. So I feel like that's I feel like I'm not fully on board that a safe space is really where the conversation should be. And also the simultaneous conversation is not simply of what students are receiving, but also what teachers are having to teach, and the kinds of threats that teachers are currently when teaching certain kinds of things. In many universities, it may not be the case in Ashoka, except if you raise something about Kashmir, but it can be about other kinds of things, say if the teacher is teaching a Ramanujan essay on the Ramayana and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So really the safe space question is not actually the most adept question to ask about how our rights are being annihilated in the present moment for me. I don't know if Saptarshi has anything to add.
No, I completely agree with you. I've nothing to add to what you said here.
Thank you, Vikram. So I think we can go to the Q&A, the audience Q&A now, because we do not have much time and there are quite a lot of questions which are pouring in. So the first question is, I think, to you, Saptarshi, in reference to your meditation. And
Right.
it suggests that, and it also quite links to what Vikram was saying with the idea of shame, right? So the person is asking how institutions trigger the concept of shame whenever one talks of sex ed, and sexualities. And this is also in reference to the court taking up the position of the parent and being like, but I don't approve of this video. I don't care what the parent approves or not. I am the father, the daddy, whoever, and I decide. So what do you have to say to that?
What exactly was the question? I did not get the question actually.
How institutions trigger the concept of shame whenever one talks of sex ed and sexualities.
Okay. It seems like a factual question to me. I'm sorry, I did not get it. What exactly is being asked. I mean, yeah, institutions do, use shame to deal with questions of sex and sexuality, but I still don't get the question.
Okay. Maybe then we can move on to the next question, or if Vikram wants
That
to.
is better. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the person who's asked that question can reword it, and in the
That would be.
meanwhile, and we can come back to that question. Yeah. Okay.
Um, Something I think which is also we constantly talk about this idea of rights, and both of you were skeptical of a framework like that. And one thing which we know that more rights do not necessarily translate to justice or even social acceptance. Then why do we insist on more rights?
Right. My sense is that's the only legitimate way in which we can ask for demands. And I like Vikram was talking about earlier, I do see the limitations of that language of rights. We are framing our demands, our desires in the language given to us by the state, right? And in such a framework, positions taken by Fatima would always fail. They'll never be. I mean, we'll never be able to translate them in the language of rights. In fact, it will be easier for us for the state to translate into the language of harm. That she's actually harming her children by sort of exposing them to all such filthy stuff, and so the state is actually being the responsible parent by protecting the children and sort of by punishing the mother. So there are limitations to the language of rights, the framework of rights, and we yet do that because it seems like there are no other alternatives. And for the last couple of years, we have seen how limiting the rights discourse is, because under the POCSO, there is a criminalization of adolescent sexuality, a concern that sex ed facilitators always feel is whether by giving sexuality related information, whether by responding to actual queries that children pose, whether they will be committing an offense under the POCSO, or if in a classroom situation children share certain information with the facilitators, by not reporting that information to the police if they'll be sort of committing an offense. So in a situation like this, we can hardly talk about sexual justice as Vikram was talking about earlier. So.
Vikram?
No, I think Saptarshi is bang on point. In fact, let me just kind of supplement what Saptarshi is saying by adding another side to this conversation, which is that the important kind of distinction that Saptarshi made in their presentation about how the state views sexuality and education as dichotomous really also maps onto another terrain of sexuality when it comes to young adults, which is, say, even in the criminal justice system. Pratiksha Bakshi's work actually shows this to us, that actually even when a child is produced in cases or as a victim of sexual violence, there is the making of an adult in that question itself. So the kinds of questions that are asked of the child have to the child has to respond almost in a kind of adult kind of way, and everything else is then part of ridicule or humiliation and so on and so forth. So actually, that binary between sexuality and education maps onto another one where sexuality is almost always seen as an adult above 18 kind of thing, and education is what is towards what belongs to children, right? And so if you were to kind of think of it as a kind of box where the binary on which this kind of laps is that because education is this field of like possibility, experimentation, imagination, adults that participate in that are only doing harm. right? And children who participate in sexuality are only participating in adult harm. And so then it's that way in which I think this kind of maps onto other kind of dichotomies and binaries in the criminal justice system itself. So that might be the only other thing I might add to that.
Yeah. And somebody was asking something very similar to this. But I think you both have tackled both of these questions unknowingly really well. And with that, I bring you with the next question. And this is probably going back to our idea of policing. And the person is asking, could you talk more about the idea of pleasure on policing? Yeah.
Ayo, acha, okay.
Okay.
That open-ended.
That open-ended. Yeah.
So in this particular case, I would highly recommend Ketki Chaudhani's work on working with actually adults who kind of talk about adolescent sexuality. And she has a rich kind of study based in many essays. One of the essays on sexuality education mentions how often informal sexuality education, so the formal is the SRHR thing that's happening in classroom. Informal is what students are picking up from outside that classroom. This could be within the university itself, as in from friendships and so on and so forth. And the kinds of things Ketki is saying that students are learning from are also disciplining things. So these are cuss words, these are peer pressure around sexuality and how to consume it, norms around masculinity, and so on and so forth. So actually, a lot of people are picking up what is sex or what sexualness looks like from these informal networks. But the kind of larger kind of impulse that I was going with is precisely that often we think of sexuality as that which the state kind of represses and has a conservative attitude towards. And so a lot of us who work in what is called sexuality activism are very wary of institutions participating in sexuality activism, right? So we would say we are wary of bureaucracy, we are wary of disciplines teaching sexuality, we are wary of laws on sexuality, and of course, we are wary of various institutions' investment in sexuality. And all I was saying is that actually to kind of, instead of kind of thinking it only in a kind of repressive manner, which is where it is containing the kind of libidinal excess of sexuality, might one think of policing itself as kind of producing certain kinds of libidinal pressures and excesses itself, right? And so might one of the great things that we might learn about policing, whether it's the neighborhood auntie who keeps a watch on you, or whether it is the person in whose custody you are tortured, what might we learn from the pleasures of policing itself, right? And so policing is not simply in a kind of negative relation to sexuality. If sexuality activism is actually invested in pleasure, then we might actually have to deal with some of these kinds of more murkier relations itself in kind of thinking about freedom and justice. So that's where I was coming from. Hope that rambling helps.
Yeah, and this also makes me think that, quite like what you're saying, that the language of sexuality is always quite phobic. It's always thought of in ways that with the how the legal imagination of it is, that it is only going to be repressive to the student body. It can never have any emancipatory potential. And therefore, this idea of rights also, which I keep on going back to, and this is probably where we started with, keeps on getting complicated, because at one end, we realize the limitation of rights, but at the other end, that's the language which we are aware of and can probably fight for.
Right, but my only kind of my only thing around that is that rights is one of many languages that democratic movements, etc., use, right? And there is a kind of there's a fetishization of when someone uses a rights-based language that they have been co-opted into the language of the state. But actually, even the most in the last 2 to 3 years of the pandemic, what we've seen, two of the largest movements in the country, both have relied on languages that are that have used rights, speaking about themselves, but also developed new vocabularies, etc. Right? So think about Shaheen Bagh saying "Kagaz nahi dikhayenge," we will not
Yeah.
show the papers. Is far more kind of far more. It actually exceeds the language of rights discourse, and I feel like there's something to that polyvocality, much like I'm trying to insist on the polyvocality of policing and its capacity to create many pleasures. Similarly, we might think of the polyvocality of movements as well, who might use the grammar of rights in one case, but also step aside from them and do many things that are not rights based on the other. So maybe that's where we might be.
Yeah. Saptarshi, any last comments? And I think we don't have any more questions per se.
I was thinking, and I was hoping this question would come up, the relationship between rights and utility.
Yeah.
In our current, in the legal understanding of rights are linked to the question of utility. So something is valued as a right, or the legal system tends to value something as a right if you tell the legal system, if you show the legal system its utility, right? So material sexuality related information can be secured as a right if you attach them to population control and that sort of stuff, right? But if you are unable to show any such utility, then the state refuses to see them as right. And pleasure does precisely that. It's difficult to sort of translate pleasure into the language of utility, and that is a stumbling block. So the definition of sexuality education that I began with, the UNFPA definition, it encourages educators to talk about intimacy, about pleasure, about the positive understanding of pleasure, body, XYZ, right? But the difficulty is that you cannot translate it into a utility, and that's where it gets delegitimized as a matter of in a rights framework. So yeah, that would be the last thing I'll say.
Yeah, that is brilliant, because then one can think of state as a sort of harnessing only on the functional aspect from probably from a very functionalist school of thought. And as soon as there is no function to it, then the investment also does not exist. And of course, pleasure is imagined in lines which is quite non-functional, sadly. But with that, I think we are going to be ending our first session, and we'll just take 2 minutes to like sort of transit into the next panel, which starts at 7:30. But I would like to thank both of you for your wonderful set of comments, for bringing such rich thoughts, ideas, musings, and making this first sort of session a hit. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. I look forward to the rest of the sessions. Good luck to the next one. Ciao.
Bye. Hello, Paramita. Hello, Indu. Is Shalini here?
Hello. I don't know if you saw my message. Hi, Indu.
Hi.
I was in a horrible traffic jam, and I actually had to call my friend en route and say, "Can I come to your place?" I'm a bit like need a few minutes to gather myself, so don't ask me to go first. I need some like time to compose myself.
It's okay. It's okay.
Paramita, I think you misspelled your name.
My name is misspelled on
Yeah.
my own. Well, fluidity ka worst case scenario.
But hi, Shalini. Would you be comfortable in going first?
Mind, yeah, definitely.
Hi.
You can hear me well, right?
Yeah.
You can hear me well, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we can go with like Shalini, Indu, and Paramita. That's okay. Good. Let's. Okay. Yeah. Because we are three panelists here. We can start, I think, like just now, and then end on time. So with that, we welcome our second panel of the evening. I am going to welcome Shalini, Indu, and Paramita Vora with us. I'll just introduce everybody. Shalini is an educator with a background in sociology. With the field experience of working with various nonprofits, she's keen to create and facilitate spaces, especially in local languages, keeping the cultural context and lived experience of everybody in the space. As a Bahujan woman, she realized that the spaces for the communities at the margin are very much lacking, especially where the spaces are co-created by the community members themselves. Shalini is especially keen to start these spaces in informal settings with women and non-binary folks in the city Hyderabad. We also have Indu Harikumar with us today. Indu is an artist, writer, and storyteller. She tells stories of body, desire, love, and belonging. She has authored and illustrated children's books and has written for major media houses across the world. Her art has been exhibited globally at Kunsthalle Bremen, Germany, the Biennial of Illustrations, Bratislava, and Kochi Musri Biennial. She is currently working on a graphic novel on oral history and caste and travel. Paramita Vora is an award-winning filmmaker and writer whose work focuses on gender, feminism, urban life, love, desire, and popular culture, and spans many forms, including documentary, fiction, print, video, and sound installation. She writes popular weekly columns in Sunday Midday and Mumbai Mirror, and is currently working on Agents of Ishq, a multimedia digital project about sex, love, and desire, which has been noticed for its fresh take and creative approach to digital media. Before we begin the session, I'll also just quickly run down the format once again. The speakers will speak on the question which is posed to them for about 10 minutes each, post which I will initiate a conversation between the panelists for another 10 minutes, following by a 20 minutes Q&A, which you all must have submitted on the Q&A option. Sorry. The question, so there is you do not have to post the question in the chat. There's a Q&A feature somewhere, and you have to download the screen. And you have to use that. The question which I'm posing for the panel is, does sex education move sex out of the private and into the public sphere? And I think Shalini is going first. So you can start.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think one of the very important aspects, even before I start, is to be very clear about the fact that I'm a practitioner. And in that way, I work in the classrooms settings with school children and young people. So I think so. I basically will talk about the experience and the understanding from a very practicing point of view. So one of the things I think very importantly, the question that is posed about what is public and what is private also, I think one is there's a huge knowledge gap for many of our children and high school graduates because school did not properly prepare them for the real life situations. And even before, when we speak of like this feminist phrase that, the personal is political, and when we talk about this phrase and when we especially look at it from the lens of sex education, I think one of the very important aspects is that it was always considered a personal matter, that sex is always a personal matter, sex education is very personal. And even when this discourse started off, I think one of the very important aspects that always keeps coming up is how personal is political. And from the feminist movements that uh, we all grew up in, I think whenever we speak of the personal is political, it is always this discourse of how then we move and make sexuality education as political as possible. And I think one of the very important aspects of it is to bring the discourse from private to the public aspect of it. And I believe that it really sort of, and the practice of actually having the sex education within the classrooms will really move that discourse from the private into the public, and which will make the reclamation of the language much more stronger, and like reclamation of the knowledge much more easier. And whenever we speak of Foucault talking about power, and that power and that knowledge is power, I think this aspect of comprehensive sexuality education, that we need to have conversations with young people within, whether it is institutional, non-institutional settings, like how a previous panelist really wonderfully actually mentioned about rights-based perspective, the problematic aspects of it, but also the aspects of it that are very, very important in terms of how we sort of deal with this. I think that is very important. I really sort of want to reconfirm this idea of how this sort of conversation will again push the discourse from private to public. And every time the discourse keeps pushing back, I believe that it is important to push this back into the public space. And one of the aspects of it which I would like to bring in, especially with rights based, and I want to just extend on to the conversation that happened in the panel before that, is that most of the practice that I've been going through within the classrooms, most of the education and the conversations that are happening are not from the rights-based perspective. And in that sense, that the education and the sexuality education is limited through the lens of either the idea of safety or through the idea of reproduction, but not with the intention of rights. And as really wonderfully pointed out by the panelists before, I think when we speak of the discourse moving from the private to public, one of the ways in which we reclaim language and one of the ways in which we reclaim the knowledge back and discourse back is by making sure that we move the focus of the education and the conversations from safety, reproduction to aspects of rights. And I think in that way, we also sort of will try to move in this space of, how the rights-based language was also talking about in terms of like international human rights community, because they also recognized, the human rights community recognizes the importance of sex education. And there are a lot of international human rights conventions and agreements that we had, which spoke about the right to sexual education. And I think especially in this particular aspect, we were talking about, what are these legal bases for right to sex education? Firstly, one is the fundamental right, and which also speaks of right to education. That everyone's right to education is compulsory. But then what even like the Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually talks about full development of human personality, and which basically takes into account how sex education is actually important in the development and well-being of the children. And in that particular say, I think one of the right to sex education also is ensured in one of the human rights Convention of European Union. And I think the reason why I'm bringing this legal base, which I think also must be known to most of us, is that sexuality education also is a way to fulfill other human rights. So, and it could be right to education, it could be right to health, it could be right for our own, right to speech, or so I think right to freedom of speech. So these are like, so how do we sort of look at sexuality education to actually be to make sure that it is a means to actually fulfill and connect to other human rights, and how do we sort of put that, sort of thread and weave other human rights together, and we look at sexuality not like a supplement of it, but actually a necessary practice of being, a ways or ways of being. I think that is one aspect of it. And like even in terms of like a lot of international conferences and international conventions actually spoke about this by UN, about this understanding of sexual and reproductive rights of adolescent and young people. And in that particular aspect, I think India is also a signatory of the 1994 United Nations International Conference on Population and Development, which basically talks about free and compulsory comprehensive sexuality education. So this is like a basic framework that I was just thinking of in terms of like, one is talking about rights-based, and which also means rights not that are given just by the state, but how do we sort of move, and this again very, very nicely pointed out, how do we sort of use the language of rights to not just talk about comprehensive sexuality education from an institutional framework of SRHR, where, again, we don't speak the language of rights, but actually create a culture within institutions, create non-institutional ways and informal ways of culture building, whether it is through our own, like the ways, the civil societies or the non-governmental organizations, which try to sort of understand, create this discourse. And the second way of doing, like, so I think one question is definitely around what are the non-institutional informal ways in which we create a culture where sexuality education actually can pick up and sort of practice this language of rights in a much more comprehensive way. I think that is one of the aspects that I was thinking that is very, very important. And here I would like to bring on my personal practice-based experiences, where as one of the gender and sexuality practitioner, I sort of prepared the materials in Telugu. And one of the ways in which that was very, very useful is how do you, and whenever we talk about reclaiming back the language, it is also important to sort of understand how everyday sexuality is, or like how do we sort of understand and create spaces where young people can imagine and also articulate their sexuality and sort of understand sexuality in spaces where they can articulate things in their own language. And I think in that way, giving them those spaces, I think, was the most powerful thing that I believe happened. And so in that way, of as a practitioner, I think rights-based, I look at it as a rights-based perspective, where how do you like look at the change of language, and how do you reclaim that language by using the language of the masses and by actually creating spaces where young people can talk about pleasure, sexuality in their own language, and in the language that usually they talk about. And that is one particular aspect. And the other aspect of it especially is in terms of the civil society, because most of the sexuality education right now that is happening is through civil society and or through NGOs. And in that, how do we make sure that young people lead this, and it is not coming from top-bottom approach, where the NGOs or the state is trying to dictate terms of how the workshops should be conducted or what is the language that should be used. And I think in this way, there's a very informal setting will really help in sort of understand the, like hear me? Hello? Oh, okay, fine. There was a power cut here. Fine. I hope you can. Yeah, thank you. So I will continue, and I will so that whenever the internet is back, I will put my video on. And I think the second aspect of it, which I think is very important, is to sort of understand in these spaces how the same discourse of power must not be utilized, in the sense that how do you center social justice and how do you center intersectionality so that the spaces are completely centered where the power discourse of the same like the elite groups talking it for the marginalized sections. I think that is something that is one of the important aspects of rights-based perspective. And another important aspect of it, I think, and then I'll probably end, is whenever we speak of public and private, there is always a reproduction of power. And one of the ways to the state and civil society does, or is by separating the private and the public. And so how do we, while even when we speak of this understanding of reclamation of public spaces, so in the same way, how do we reclaim back the language? How do we reclaim back the knowledge? And how do we reclaim back the discourse? And also the aspect of then creating a culture of sexuality education, where it is not just informal and led by the state, but also how do rights look like in practice? And while I'm ending that, I just want to like give a couple of questions in terms of like, one is how do rights look like in practice? And the second is that where do institutions draw the line so that they don't reproduce the same discourse, so that we create more non-institutional spaces and we create culture. And the third very important aspect is where do we advocate for rights without being taken over, or without having the fear of being taken over by the dominant forms of language and power. I think these are very important provocations. I think was a part of like the way it really helped me practicing, and the more I am in touch with the classrooms every day.
Hello. I think your voice is getting a little.
Looking at young people, keep engaging.
Shalini, your voice is getting muffled.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, so I just want to end by making these provocations, and also the idea of how the more I am in touch with classrooms and engage with young people all around in schools and colleges, the more I sort of keep understanding the importance of creating more non-institutional informal ways of culture, where the students, where the young people take over, and also sort of use the rights-based in a way where rights-based language is in a way where the discourse is taken back from the private to the public. I think I'll stop here and we can have more conversations.
Thank you. I think Indu is going next. Shrija is going to share the screen.
Okay.
Just
I don't want the screen to be shared now. Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Indu, and I'm an artist, and I'm also extremely nervous. So I'm going to be reading out from my phone. I hope everyone can hear me. My work comes from an extremely personal space, and what I'm going to be saying is also extremely personal. 6 years ago is when I started collating people's experiences around dating, their bodies, sex, sexuality, gender-based violence, abortion, etc. Just before that, if a cishet man ever spoke to me about sex, I think that he'd want to sleep with me. Or I'd wonder what I had done. I'd either be really worried or be really turned on. But now, after years of doing the work that I do, having windows into people's private lives, I've had to tell my partner, boss, thoda up your sexting game. Occupational hazard this is. My work involves hearing stories around what turns people on and what not. I need thoda more. I started 100 Indian Tinder Tales because in the spaces that I occupied, almost everyone was married. I was told that after 30, no man will look at you. Like there was a shelf life. Bollywood had taught me प्यार एक बार होता है, and life had taught me मुझ जैसे लोगों के साथ तो होगा भी नहीं. The chances were really few. But at 35, after a major heartbreak, I found I was in Vienna, and I found that white men were lining up for me, first through Tinder and then later because I was exotic and beautiful, something I never heard about while I was here. I wondered ye kya ho raha hai, but jo bhi tha, I wanted it to stay. So when I came back to India, I had to try Tinder in India. So I tried it both in Delhi and in Mumbai, and I didn't last for more than a day because people were Googling me, sending me Facebook requests, and then jumping right into questions around sex. I was thoda creeped out. Plus, my dateability was back where it was, in the dumps. So I wanted to ask, boss, is it just me? What are other people's experiences? Which is why I took to the internet. I didn't think anyone was going to be vulnerable with this stranger. So I went back to Tinder. I told myself this was my space too, and I was not going to be thrown off because someone asked me about sex. And my experience was slightly different. One person did start with spit or swallow. And when I said spit, he went on to tell me how it was not respectful for women to answer such questions. That was my first post. And I'm going to share that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh God. I will stop share. That was my first post. Another person I matched with, who was in the city for an interview and whom I met for drinks, asked me after some serious flirtation if I'd go back to his hotel room. And I said no. And our conversation didn't get awkward. Flirtation could continue and I could come back home. And that made me feel I could do this again. Of course, life had other plans because people were sending me their experiences on Tinder and they were eager that I draw them. I did. In the first few stories, no one talked about sex. I was happy to draw people kissing. Then I got a story where someone said that they liked it rough. I wasn't sure if nudity was okay. What would people think of me? Would it make the internet unsafe for me? Could I draw nipples, penises, breasts? I tested the waters. I drew them showing from bed sheets. I remember as soon as I posted that story, the story started to change. People talked about blowjobs, casual sex, bad sex, good sex, abuse, etc. Slowly, I started to show a little bum here, a part of the penis there, and a little bust here and there. It felt safe. If then someone had told me that 3 years down the line, you're going to draw 50 different breasts, I wouldn't believe it because this was already too overwhelming. Some stories were intense of loss and abuse, and people were sending it to me on my Facebook Messenger. And I thought they needed to be consoled. But over time, I've learned that people want to share their experiences. A lot of them want to be drawn, and they want others to know about these deeply private parts of their lives. They come back to look at comments. They write back saying how much better they feel about having their story there in the world. It's a sort of release, a kind of letting go. celebration of a part of their lives, crying, finding community, feeling less alone. And I found out that no one really wanted my advice, and they just wanted to be heard. And that just made me feel a lot better. As an artist, I start each project to know how people do these things. And what I've gotten is a sense of belonging, community, and immense trust. Now, is there a better way of validating? I mean, is there a bigger form of validation than trust? I don't think so. I'm not sure if I would send my nude if another artist decided to draw breasts. I wasn't sure anyone was going to send me nudes. But this started as a conversation on Instagram. We were talking about breasts. And this person said how men react when she enters a room, how they only see her big breasts. And I said how I'd felt inadequate since the time I was a teen. And I thought I must increase that bust and all my problems would go away. Our experiences were different, but they were also similar. So I asked her if this would make an interesting project. And she said yes. And that's how it started. I cannot say that this wasn't overwhelming and emotionally challenging. But to look at 50 different bodies and different stories and different struggles and stories of acceptance made me feel like I was not alone. It is our pain that we hide that brings us close together. It is our stories that make us believe that we belong. When we air them out, there is precious connection to be had. Each one, whether it has been gender-based violence, abortion, stories around consent, all of these have come from a deeply personal place, from a place of curiosity, to know how to do life, to learn from each other, to feel less alone, to know if behind all our filters are others struggling, just like the way I do. I know when I faced gender-based violence in an intimate relationship, I didn't have the vocabulary to label it or make sense of it. I was so ridden with shame and so torn and heartbroken that it took me Meena Kandaswamy's piece in the Outlook to make some sense of my pain. When the stories started to trickle in for my project, a lot of them chronologically mentioned acts of transgression and violence, but not much about how they felt or why they stayed. In some stories, I thought it was necessary to probe and asked writers if they'd be okay and to share just what they were comfortable with. This was extremely tricky for me because I didn't know if anything I may be saying would be uh, triggering for the writers. The writers talked about how they had shut down their experiences, and revisiting it was painful but also cathartic. With the writers being vulnerable and generous with their experience, they also gave readers a vocabulary, a similar, uh, um, a similar kind of vocabulary that reading Meena Kandaswamy's piece perhaps gave me. Someone wrote in to say, for someone who's always put herself through hell for not being more smart about the obvious red flags, it gives guilty comfort to know that others have gone through it too. And that maybe sometimes it's not always the bearer's fault. I understand you must be going through a lot yourself, reading and filtering these stories, must be tiresome and triggering, but thank you so much for the work that you do. Much as we need safe spaces in our homes and our schools to talk about sex and our bodies, why shouldn't the world be one such place too? I was once called to a school in Mumbai where their menstruation class was open to all. Since mine was a hush experience, I saw what a difference it made to the students. It wasn't shame inducing. It was not something to giggle about. Students had been trusted with information, and when people are treated with that sort of respect and dignity, they treat you and sex with the same kind of dignity, or so one hopes. Hopefully, these children are not teasing each other saying, aha, Japan, huh, Japan, which was what boys in my school did. It meant jumping and pumping all night. When I was young, sex was considered pap, We didn't go all the way. And even if we did, we never talked about it. That's changing. And people are willing and talking about the complexities of relationships rather than hiding behind the filters of perfection that social media and society allows us. I would have never imagined I'd be doing the project that I'm doing now, where people are sharing stories about their experiences with penises. It makes me hopeful for our sexual lives and pleasure. We can tease the lines between private and public, and we can play and learn, and we can listen to each other and hold each other up. I want to invite each one of you to join the conversation at Individuality. And together, let's create the space of kindness, consent, and respect, a sanctuary for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Indu. We have Paramita now, and yes, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Shalini and Indu, for your talks, because I couldn't agree more with what both said. That on the one hand, there is an idea of rights which underpins our conversations about sexuality and sexuality education, that we need to keep in mind, that we need to be sure that the larger domain of rights is fulfilled, even as the imperative of sexuality education is fulfilled. And with Indu also, I agree that if you talk to people about their love lives, as you might want to speak about your love life, actually, or your sex life, they're already educated. I mean, they already know about their own love lives and sex lives, right? I mean, when we started Agents of Ishq, but even before Agents of Ishq and all the other work that I did, I would find like we did a penis survey in the first year of Agents of Ishq, and we were staggered to find that more than 1,000 people responded to it. They were not all posh English speaking types either. All kinds of people responded, and actually, what it revealed was far more tenderness, far more self-love than we also imagine that people have. So I think that the issue of language is constantly at the heart of talking about sexuality, as Shalini also touched upon. And the idea that we speak in a language that is emotional, cultural, and not only a rights-based language is also very important in doing this. But the proposition, the question that you asked about whether it brings sex from the private and the public actually made me think of a few other questions. And one of them is, are the private and the public really two hermetic spaces? Are they so separated from each other? And I'm thinking of, I live in Bombay, and most Bombayites know that you can be walking on Marine Drive, which is like the main public space, and there will be uncles in shorts and socks up to their knees taking their evening walk, and there will be people with dogs, and there will be clusters of women in burqas eating mungfali, and there will be lovers kissing. And everybody will accord them a kind of privacy right there in the middle of public space. And I think that to me says that the private and the public are always inside each other. They're not actually in two separate spaces. So really, I also feel like maybe we need to think a little bit more about this journey of private and public to and from each other. It's not as if one goes to the other and the other never goes to the other's place, it's that rare kind of dating scenario where both have got own place. So, and I think also it leads to the other question, where does education take place? Does education really take place only in school or college or an institutional space? Or are we constantly having an education in the culture, in our families, in our private relationships, and in our lived lives themselves? So in some ways, talking about sex education actually is very important because it questions the purpose of education, and it questions what we think is education and where it's taking place and how it is taking place. And I think that takes us to the more important question, the more exciting question, which is, where does sex exist? Sex too actually exists not only in the private space, right? It is there in public space. It is there in the cultural space. It is there in popular culture. It is there in high culture. Not enough in high culture, but lots in popular culture, which is why high culture is always saying popular culture is not that great, because it's vulgar and it's full of juicy, explicit, complicated, not always politically correct iterations of sex, right, and sexualness. And sex exists in public health, in medicine. So I don't think that sex exists only in private. It exists everywhere. So in some ways, that also leads to the question, why are we thinking of sex education as in one pocket? And this idea that sex must always be an exception is perhaps something we could like tease a little bit more when we think about all of this. I feel like Shalini and Indu that, it's something that there's a lot of learning that happens when you work directly on sexuality or sexuality education and adjacent to education kind of efforts. Like for me, it's been a big learning these 7 years. And that itself tells you that learning is co-created by people when they have a conversation, right? That of course you enter as a practicing artist, I entered with wanting to make a kind of language. And I found that people were very quickly able to read that language and quickly able to respond to it. They understood actually the language of culture and what conversation was welcome. And they have reshaped Agents of Ishq with their stories. It's not as if it's a rigid format that people enter, but it's continuously being transformed by both the people who send in their stories and the people who actually come and work at Agents of Ishq. People who draw, people who intern, people who, whatever they do actually in Agents of Ishq changes the shape of that space, right? Which is not very good for great success and world domination, but it's actually great for learning and growing and feeling pretty happy, So I think if there's one thing that we learn from thinking through sexuality is that it's often insufficient to describe that the binary of private and public or anything is insufficient to describe experience. And I personally have found it very helpful to think in terms of 3 spaces: the private, the public, and the personal. And the personal being a space in which we are continuously remixing the private and the public as we wish. I think the idea that there can be the public is always presented to us as somehow this non-denominational space. It's where what we should all aspire for. We should all be able to say everything openly. But I want to ask why we don't think that the right to not say anything if we don't feel like it is not an equally important right. That the right to keep something secret because it's delicious or because we like it, because that's how we feel. Why is that not also something we think about? So I think that the idea of the public defining aspiration is something that sex education or sexuality conversations can question. And I think because actually sex education happens mostly in the informal domain, it hardly happens within schools. We also need to ask ourselves why it is so comfortable talking about itself as education and what kind of syllabus it is there for working with and putting into play, right? And I'm going to share screen because I think one of the things that we found while working at Agents of Ishq was that when we started out, there was not very much conversation about sex online. I mean, of course, the home of sex is online. But nevertheless, there weren't too many conversations of this kind. And so the kind of things people said were far more unmoderated. But as time has gone by and there are more sexuality education ventures and efforts and all sorts of expressions online, kind of woke language or the idea of what is correct sexualness or not correct sexualness has really taken root. And it's something that eats into people. So I'm going to share a few short narratives. Can you see my screen? So, I mean, I'm going to read it out just in case somebody's not wearing their reading glasses and can't read this. But it's a little, this is from a narrative called My Struggle Was With Being Sexual, Not Homosexual. It's a little known among my circle that up to class 8, I serially crushed on boys, 1 per year. Maybe it's because after the last boy I liked, I realized I was queer. And when you're queer, your story always begins from the moment you knew you were gay. Before I even knew I was queer, I knew what LGBT rights was. So when I finally realized I was gay, I was happy to have an identity that held some socio-political significance, and I felt like a krantikari. But soon I got really confused. Was I bisexual? Was I lesbian? But what about those light-eyed boys I had crushes on, etc.? In the relentless determining who I was, I left behind my ability to fall in love or feel desire without the baggage of my identity. In college, I started to know who I was. Rather, I got better at explaining what I identified as. I came out building a reputation as that queer person, that queer artist, that relentlessly gay friend. But in truth, just as a person, I had no clue how to navigate my love and sex life. I had placed all my value in making my identity useful, something Saptarshi touched upon, right? And prioritized it over, or perhaps even interchanged it with my actual personal life. I was out and proud, but inside I found myself stumbling upon shame more and more. The shame, though, was not about being queer. In truth, just as a person, I had no clue how to navigate my love and sex life. I had placed all my, sorry, I'm repeating this. But basically, the writer talks about how not knowing how to ask for love, not knowing how to actually admit even that you are in love, and not knowing that much about their own sexual desires, because it is all about public identity and public language of sex life, right? Similarly, this was a really wonderful piece that we got from somebody, which started out as an email to say, I appreciate Agents of Ishq because I can be confused over there, which is, of course, the worst thing. You are not supposed to be confused. You're always supposed to know, is it yes or is it no? Are you straight or are you gay? You're just never supposed to be confused about anything. The discourse around what's toxic is so decontextualized and oversimplified that it is completely impervious to the complexity that undergirds the act of understanding and knowing someone intimately. People act and react in various ways because of multiple reasons and their respective equations. She talks about how her relationship has some kind of particularities, which if she thinks about it with a feminist hat on would be, oh, are they red flags? Oh, am I a bad feminist? Oh, is this abusive, right? But then when I think about the intentionality of his embrace or the loving warmth of his arms, and all the familiarity we have had over the years, it makes me wonder if he's just busy today and not in the best mood to talk, and I should stop looking for patterns because both of us are frequently busy and continue to make it work besides that. Don't all relationships reveal their own patterns, their own ethical logics? Can we see behaviors as homogeneous and ready to pass quality checks like items in a factory line? I think also most interesting was this piece. I knew what made me feel good while masturbating, but I didn't remember feeling the explosive moment or a culmination that everyone talked about. In a context where we are relentlessly talking about pleasure online, what does pleasure really mean? Nobody ever discusses that, right? You're all automatically supposed to know. And it is always equated with orgasm. I mean, asexuality continues to try and challenge that. But, it also gets put in a different box, whereas I think there's a lot that asexuality is challenging about who gets to define pleasure and what pleasure should be. Most of this, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll quickly summarize. But the writer talks about having actually very open relationship with their friends. And we discuss everything about sex. And our more experienced friends tell us exactly how it happens. And we are, even miming our romantic and sexual escapades sometimes. But I don't know how to tell my friends that I've never had an orgasm during masturbation. This piece is, of course, very directly titled Rubbing, Nothing Happening. And my first real orgasm was probably the first time I was truly alone with myself in my room. Neither friends nor outside thoughts encroached upon my space, and that privacy helped. I wasn't eagerly waiting for something external like my mental list of orgasm indicators or thinking about my friends' experiences. So the idea that, there's an outside world that doesn't let you actually express your private self really calls into question what is it that we want of sexuality education, where we want it to take place, how we want it to take place. I think what is important is that when there are narratives where people talk about their personal lives, like this by a young gay person who talks about having erotic relationships with women, erotic friendships, and how that exists in a sexual, romantic, emotional domain. There's an emotional world of sex, which doesn't necessarily want to put itself into any kind of clear box, doesn't want to simplify what is there between people. I think what it actually tells us is that the world of sex is its own place for education. Actually, people learn about sex by entering the domain of sex. It's certainly true for me. And I think that we could think about what it's really telling us about reshaping the public domain, right? How do these numerous iterations actually become extremely inclusive and intersectional in a very fluid fashion? Because they also take into account the intersectionality of people, that it is about our public, our private, and our personal selves. It's also about our emotional, our intellectual, and our social selves, right? We are our identity, but we're also our biography. We're also what we become. We are not only what we came from. So these kind of continuous movements that are occurring, they actually provide for us a new understanding of what can be a public world, what can be education, what can be politics. So I think that, the idea that sex education is something that sex gives us is something we don't talk about often enough. And maybe it would help us reimagine sexuality education, even in schools or other spaces, in a different way if we could just open this up. Thank you.
Wow, those were some rich set of comments. I'm taken aback. and I have so much to talk to you about. So I'll pose a quick question, and this is time for everybody in the audience to also start pouring in their questions if they haven't already. And post my question, I hope we can engage with the audience. But something which I think Parumita's talk took me to, and also what Indu was saying and Shalini pointed us to, is that whenever we are talking about sex and sexuality, we are also talking about who I am and what has happened to me. So the questions of sex and sexuality are rooted in the questions of self and the questioning of the self. And by not probably by not having a sort of sex education, a formal sex education, somehow are we limiting the possibilities of knowing the self, of having conversation with different facets of self? Is that something which this the question, the probing of who one is somehow getting limited in that sense? And yeah, so any first thoughts, comments are welcome.
Well, maybe somebody can. I mean, I had something to say, but since I just finished talking, I think maybe either Shalini or Indu could respond first.
Yeah.
Paramita, you should totally go ahead.
Yeah, very.
Well, I mean, like I'm often confused about this question that you asked, which is why I'm responding to it. But I think that what we want from school education about sex may be something like an ordinariness in the way that we talk about the body, right? That the way that we ordinarily talk. And I don't want to use the word normal, right? I think like a lot of what happens in the informal sexuality education, it's absolutely normal if you do this. It's absolutely normal if you do that. But this kind of continuous use of the word normal, which is normative, is really unsettling for me, actually. So I think like maybe school has a limited part to play in what sexuality education is. I think like imagining that school is going to fulfill and that we want everything to come under the purview of institutions and state and so on and so forth, and inevitably replicate what Shalini said, like existing power structures. The whole purpose of education was to create elites. So I don't know that education is going to break that so easily, right? But there is some kind of limited purpose. For the rest, isn't it a political project? I mean, this project of talking about sex, and how will we talk about it? Every time that we try to talk about sex, the market, the government, maybe even academics, they immediately tell us what is the terms of discussion, right? So I think like, how do we reclaim our personal vulgarity in some ways? Maybe what is the place that gives us the confidence to be who we are? I mean, what is personhood if it's not the confidence to be who you are and have the confidence to also make space for others? And what is personhood? I don't know, right? So rights have some part to play in it. Love has a lot of part to play in it. Empathy and kindness, learning about others, all these things do. So I think that's the unfortunately wider question for me.
Yeah, thank you. Shalini, I think, was saying something.
Oh no, I was, I think, very wonderfully Paramita and Indu have articulated. One of the really important things, even that comes up during the workshops in the spaces, is I think the first stage of actually sexuality education is to understand yourself and your own bodies and how comfortable are you, or just getting to know your comfort, getting to sort of hear your thoughts, just be in that space where you are able to think what you're thinking, and I think hear your voice. I think one of the very important aspects when the workshops used to happen, and we would have these like invisible letters written where the students would write, but they would not address it with their name. And one of the things that really I remember mentioning was about how they realized that they didn't know until then that when they could speak that they would utter the word vagina. In that sort of thing, they one of the students actually said that that sort of really helped them understand how I never thought that this could, like, this just uttering it a little louder for themselves, something that they thought was really just took, like, not completely, but sort of like was a step to understand their own relationship with shame. and their own relationship with bodies. And I think not just that, but in many, many ways, I think just the fact that there is a conversation that's happening on bodies, and then everyone is seated there. And it's not always the only way, but I think those conversations actually really help the students understand themselves, but also students understanding them is actually the first step to moving ahead in that. And I think that really is what what you spoke about, and your question is sort of like the most important part of the aspect of it, of how we sort of, even when we sort of have these conversations, that is the way to move forward. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Indu?
See, I have completely lost the train of thought, so I'm going to pass this.
Okay, so maybe the next question does come from what you were talking about, and we can pose it to you and you can start. Somehow you use the word belonging, and I know Agents of Ish talk a lot about vulnerability and trust and making a space. And this makes me think that a lot of the work you do are based on stories. And then what do you think is the role of those stories? What is the functionalities of those stories when we think about sex education?
Okay. One of the things that I felt in doing the work that I do, and also I see that when people send in stories, they also want, there is something that they have in mind, which I'm usually unaware of. But when I draw it, there's also something that I have in mind. But when I hear from people, it's completely different from what I had in mind. And what I find most fascinating about stories is that they allow you the space to take whatever you want. They don't impose. This is somebody's personal experience, so it allows you the space. It doesn't tell you that, hey, this is what you're supposed to take in this, but you take. And I've seen that people take, like, I wouldn't have thought about it because it's not my experience at all. But somebody takes something completely different from that story and will come back and say, this really helped me to tackle something that I've been thinking about for many, many days. And so which is what I find most beautiful about stories, that they allow you the space to be who you are and take what you want, and they don't impose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I say something? I mean,
Yes.
I agree with Indu. And I think another thing that happens with stories is that, I think you can't instrumentalize everything so much, right? Like stories don't serve an instrumental purpose, but I also think that they serve a rather beautiful way of creating community, which is to say that every time a story comes out, there are so many reactions, there are so many engagements, and there are more stories that come in either about the same thing or something that has been triggered in the mind of the person who read it, right? And I think like this idea of creating a community of stories, the lived wisdom of a community, is a very important thing. It's where people are defining for themselves the terms of sex education, if you want to call it that, but it's about lived wisdom, right? And a very interesting example that I want to share with you is we did a write your own porn story contest a couple of months ago. And we said, write your own blue film, because in India, you always say blue film. You don't say porn that much. I mean, now you do, but for a long time. And what was really interesting is we didn't tell people any parameters. And people wrote amazing stories. First of all, like they sent that we got quite a lot of entries, which always amazes me. Masturbation and Shairi, a lot of entries. Porn story, a lot of entries. But what we saw in those stories fascinated us. One, the effortless way in which people actually used Indian metaphors, right? Her breasts were as soft as paneer, or her breasts were like modaks, or so this way of being able to describe with a lot of facility, actually, the sexual surrounding in a culturally relevant way, right? That's pretty important, because otherwise all the stuff that's online is Western. And people take that Western language in that Western context, and it becomes quite violent emotionally when it is imposed upon the structure here, I think. So there's one thing is that it becomes positive to be sexual. Right now, Indian culture and oh, Indian culture is not this and that, but then suddenly it's all Indian culture only, na? Modaks and paneer and all. And another thing is that, questions about consent, mutuality, so on and so forth, they were quite effortlessly mixed in with those stories. So what it tells me is that over the years, now, of course, you can turn on and say Agents of Ishq, it's not like a 2 million strong community or something, but that community continuously engaging not only with AOI, but probably with many other such things, it has educated itself and it is able to combine sensuality and consensuality quite okay without any difficulty. It is able to be carnal and romantic in the same place. It is able to be culturally relevant on its own. So I think that's really the importance of stories, that they allow people to learn what they want from it and to keep building on that learning, to have a dynamic agency vis-a-vis their context.
I have something else to add. I was one of the other things that I see in about stories is that as soon as I've seen how, I'm not someone who, when I start my projects, I don't anticipate how it's going to take off, because that would be too scary. I wouldn't start at all. But what I see is that people come and change narratives. So, I think that, oh, this is going to go this way. And somebody comes and tells a story which is slightly different, and a whole bunch of other people, then it becomes okay for a whole bunch of people to have had that experience and sometimes to also share that experience, which is something that I find very fascinating about stories. Yeah.
And this makes me sort of, my last comment or question to you would be that then the space beyond private and public is probably the space of stories, is the space of vulnerability, empathy, and a space where there is the possibility of change of narratives. There is enough trust that your idea of sexuality is not set in stone, but there's fluidity to it. So yeah, any set of final comments, and I think ending the session. Yeah. So thank you, three of you. You have been wonderful. I am in awe, and I have so much to chew on, so much to think about post this. This is a conversation in process. However, unfortunately, we have run the course of time for this panel. And with that, thank you to the speakers who presented their thoughts, their musing, ideas with such passion and made this otherwise very mundane evening charged with politics. This concludes the first day of our conversation on the multiple understandings of sex education. We will come back here tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Sharp with a wonderful set of scholars, writers, teachers, and students to discuss more queries we have around sex education. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. See you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.